Good evening and thank you for coming. I'm Sean Denniston, Vice President of the Arlington Historical Society, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lindsey Bestebreurtje, who will be speaking tonight on her thesis, which is her book about Arlington development, suburbanization, and community development. Lindsey is I think a young and innovative historian, and we're very lucky that her innovation or the fruits of her labor actually took place in our own backyard of Arlington, not only tying a lot of threads together from Jim Crow and segregation, the built environment to governance, but also help give the community of Halls Hill, it sort of re-engage their voice and I think help spur the interest that we have in them in Halls Hill and our other Black communities. Lindsey is a graduate of William and Mary and earned her MA and PhD at George Mason. I think she's had several positions, including now, I believe, the Smithsonian. And I think enough of the introduction. Let's hear the star of the show, Lindsey Bestebreurtje.
All right, there we go. So yes, my name is Lindsey Bestebreurtje, and I'm a historian of African American community development and the built environment in the 19th and 20th century American South. I want to thank our host for inviting me to speak with you all today. So my presentation explores segregation and the racialized zoning and planning laws in Arlington to see the ways in which these policies impacted the county's suburban growth from the 1900s to the mid 20th century. I'm going to open at the turn of the last century when Arlington's suburban boom first began, laying out the race-based policies of early boosters. And then I'm going to continue into a discussion of restrictive covenants, planning laws, and how Arlington's communities, both Black and white, grew together and in opposition. The majority of this research comes from my book, Built by the People Themselves, which was published last year by USC Press. Before we get into our discussion of the suburban boom of the 20th century, I'm going to give a bit of context about the roots of Arlington's Black community by doing a deeper dive onto two neighborhoods that I believe many of you will have heard of before. The first is Knock Green Valley, and the second is Freedman's Village. So Green Valley was Arlington's earliest Black community. Its roots can be traced back to the 1840s. At this time, the county was predominantly made up of small farms, which were growing staple crops, though there were a few larger plantations, including the Park Custis family's Arlington house. Arlington had a relatively small free Black population in the decades leading up to the Civil War. At the time in 1840, there were 290 enslaved and 235 free people of color within an entire population of about 1,500. These individuals included the Jones family. In 1844, Sarah and Levi Jones purchased 14 acres of land to farm and built a big two-story house in the log cabin style. With their home and land, Levi and Sarah Jones set the area on a path to become a community after the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War drew to a close. And because of their early building and their commitment to community development in the years following freedom, Green Valley's residents really see this as sort of the founding moment of their community. So beyond the foundations of what would become Green Valley, the other of Arlington's earliest Black communities is Freedmen's Village. Freedmen's Village was opened by the War Department in 1863 on the land that would become Arlington National Cemetery. The idea behind Freedmen's Village was to imagine a future for the enslaved population beyond returning them to the land as laborers. Freedmen's Village was what's called a contraband camp, which was essentially a refugee camp established by the Union Army for self-emancipating enslaved individuals. So most of these encampments throughout the South were really just bare bones institutions where you would provide food, clothing, shelter, and even those would be at the most kind of rudimentary levels. However, at Freedmen's Village, the federal government took what was at that time cutting edge suburban and urban planning and applied it to Freedmen's Village. So they created gently curving streets around a centralized man-made lake. There were 100 1.5-story whitewashed, simple clapboard houses. They established a school, a vocational school for adults, as well as a home for the elderly and a hospital. And the enslaved individuals who came to live at Freedmen's Village took this springboard of the infrastructure that the government had created and went above and beyond. The school, for example, had 900 students at any given time. The literacy rates in the village rose from about 20% to over 50% within the span of just a few years. They realized that not only children, but also adults had a real passion for education once they were provided with the opportunity. And so they also created a night school. The residents themselves took about to farming. I believe 3 church congregations were created. So it was very much the government built the structures and the people built the community. And so those early, sorry, this is a picture of the school. Those early institutions would really come to shape Arlington County in the years following the closure of the village in 1900. So while many of these contraband camps closed at the very end of the Civil War, Freedmen's Village remained open until 1900. But unfortunately, the village was not invulnerable to turning tides of late 19th century anti-Black sentiments. The reemerged local Democratic Party attacked the village as an illegitimate Black voting bloc, while land developers sought to remove the Black neighborhood in what was quickly becoming a very densely populated suburban area. And also the powers that be at Arlington Cemetery wanted that land to be able to expand the cemetery. This local push against Freedmen's Village mirrored national shifts away from African-American rights and social programs, which waned throughout the 1870s. And in the end, the lack of federal support, as well as the local push against them, resulted in the closure of Freedmen's Village. In the end, the residents were all were given payments for their homes, averaging about $100. That's despite any improvements, expansion, plantings that they might have done. And 37 years after its opening, the last of the villagers left Freedmen's Village. And they spread out throughout the county in what I call the Freedmen's Village diaspora, creating various African-American enclaves and neighborhoods. You see a continued expansion of Green Valley after this closure. Halls Hill, similarly, is founded at the very tail end of the Civil War, and then its African-American population is expanded by that relocation of individuals, and many of the church congregations as well moved beyond the village to places like Queen City, Green Valley, and Halls Hill. So here you can see the different areas in the county which had African-American populations, and those areas that are neighborhoods and enclaves. And for me, the difference in that is an enclave is anywhere that has a small group of multiple African-American households. But for me, an African-American neighborhood would also include institutions like businesses, churches, schools, which others would travel into for those services. So you saw on that map how the closing of Freedmen's Village expanded existing communities and also created new communities like Queen City, East Arlington, Roslyn, and Johnson's Hill. The images on this slide show the Johnson's Hill neighborhood and one of its prominent residents, Harry W. Gray, who built this Italianate Revival style townhouse in the early 20th century. And I think that this townhouse is really interesting because it shows a vision for an Arlington that ultimately didn't come about or wouldn't come about for quite some time, because Gray imagined that Arlington would one day come to look much more like the homes of Georgetown or Foggy Bottom. And Foggy Bottom had a large Black population at the time. And so he decided to create a row house with the prospect of further developing the area in the future. So he imagined a more kind of urban vision for Arlington. Now, Gray was born enslaved at Arlington House. He would come to live and work at Freedmen's Village in Freedom. And he used the vocational and educational training at Freedmen's Village to become a federal worker, first as a laborer and later as a clerk with the Department of the Interior. And he was someone who was definitely committed to not only, growing his own family, but also the community writ large in Johnson's Hill. So that brings us to what's going to be the start of our suburbanization journey. And it's worth noting that kind of the most forward thinking and the most quick to pick up on this trend of suburbanization was Arlington's African-American community, who were building these neighborhoods before similar boosters and developers were doing the same within the white population. So something that this lecture will touch on is what constitutes a suburb and how that changed over time. the ramifications of segregation on the lived experience and the environment, and to really look at how Arlington's proximity to DC impacted the area's development with employment, residents, and policy. Exploring Arlington's persistent Black neighborhoods allows us to expand definitions of suburb by including minority and working class perspectives, and by showing how the meaning changed over time. The environments described by suburban in Arlington changed from being one of an isolated suburban village, communities dotted across the landscape, to being one contiguous, dense suburban environment of interconnected communities. Like if you're driving in Arlington, you don't really know when one community ends and the next begins, unless you happen to catch one of those pretty little signs that a lot of them have out. So residents of Arlington, both Black and white, saw themselves as living in suburbs by the 1890s. So for example, sorry, I missed a page. So you have different advertisements for Halls Hill. The first from 1872 and the second from 1892. And it shows this evolution of how the county is changing, because it goes from describing how you could, for example, grow your own crops on your large, if within your backyard, to talking about how you can catch the railway car. And, but in both, you're using the word suburban. I think that's important to note only because a lot of folks tend to think of the first suburbs as sort of being invented in like the 40s or the 50s, but that wasn't the case either for how the people saw themselves or how land developers saw the area as well. All right, so that's a lot of kind of background and descriptors, bringing us now to the 20th century. Arlington's neighborhoods were diverse in class makeup as well as race. Arlington had both Black and white neighborhoods and enclaves dotted throughout the county. And we really want to understand this community growth and the physical spaces. So as Arlington began to boom, enterprising developers began to realize that in order to control the aesthetics and class, but above all race makeup, and the wealth that was at stake in these communities, that they would need to create a system of county-wide control. So we have these diverse neighborhoods dotted around the county, and the powers that be are kind of realizing that they're leaving a lot of money on the table by allowing folks to kind of haphazardly build their own homes and communities. So Arlington's boosters and developers increasingly turned their attention to state and county politics. So at the onset of the 20th century, Arlington underwent a suburban boom that was spurred by the lure of federal jobs and also of railway expansion. And from 1900 to 1910, the county's population grew from 6,000 to 10,000, just over those 10 years. And during that same decade, 70 new neighborhoods developed in Arlington. These communities battled for physical space in what we know is a very small county. And this competition for space also included divisions over competing aesthetics and ideas of what constituted desirable homes, neighborhoods, and neighbors. And the types of homes that were created were very much tied to class, where you have, working class neighborhoods like Queen City, which had very simple clapboard style houses that were often built by the owners themselves. And then the aesthetic choices in more middle-class communities, such as the middle-class Lion Park, had aesthetics of a traditional sort of streetcar suburb. You see here these, pre-platted out roads and lots made up exclusively of single-family homes. So it's not that, it's no longer this townhouse vision of what might be, but we're looking very much at single-family homes. And this definitely shaped Arlington's earliest development. So there were two primary developers and leaders at this time, and they were Frank Lyon and Crandall Mackey. These two men had similar social and political opinions, and in 1890, they established the Good Citizens League. The League was a social and political group comprised of about 20 of the county's wealthiest and most prominent white men. Many League aims centered on bringing municipal improvements to the county. They pushed for a centralized public water supply and a sewer system. Arlington also undertook significant road paving campaigns and sidewalk construction, also the creation of curbs, street lamps, and telephone lines. And though these reforms addressed legitimate municipal needs, League members sought this suburban infrastructure specifically so that they could control the path of development. According to League member Frank Ball, whose family founded Ballston, quote, "Those interested in developing real estate in the county helmed the League. They saw this organization as a life or death struggle, without which Arlington would never have grown into a fine residential community," end quote. Now, these municipal improvements were quite easily secured by white neighborhoods, but white Arlington officials cared little about whether or not these amenities made it into the Black parts of town, which were, again, these already existing neighborhoods. As opposed to the newly platted areas, these neighborhoods arguably are some of the ones in most need of it because people are already living there. Okay, so when speaking about the county's water supply and sewage system, for example, county officials announced that they had made improvements in every, quote, neighborhood where there are a number of respectable white people residing, end quote, but no such assurances were made for the African-American neighborhoods. And after a decade of road improvements, Arlington's Black neighborhoods did not have paved streets. Green Valley, Queen City, and Halls Hill all had unfinished roads and unsurfaced streets into the 1940s. Arlington's early boosters and developers supported residential segregation. Those League members who were developers themselves created racially segregated communities. Mackey created Maywood, Lyon created Lyon Park and Lyon Village, William Ball created Ballston, and George A. Rucker was a builder in all of these various communities, and these were all League members. So to shape public opinion in accordance with the League's focus on white middle-class suburban development, Frank Lyon purchased the weekly newspaper, The Monitor, and under Lyon's leadership as the owner and editor, The Monitor pushed League policies and opinions, including calls for a new state constitution specifically to limit the voting rights of Black citizens, which were their political opposition. In this environment, Virginia did indeed create a new constitution in 1902, which disenfranchised nearly all Black voters across the state And Lyon and Mackey both served as Arlington's members on that constitutional convention. This statewide change fit with county desires. Despite small population numbers and restricted rights for African Americans, to kind of drum up support for this new constitution, the Monitor had a lot of racialized fear mongering, with white citizens in Arlington falsely claiming that, quote, large Black majorities had to be overcome to ensure that Arlington would be a, quote, white man's county with white man's rule, end quote. So this new, the new voter requirements under the 1902 Constitution resulted in the disenfranchisement of African Americans in Arlington and throughout the state. And the overall effect of the new franchisement requirements was to cut the total vote in half in Virginia. And this also resulted in lower voter turnout that would continue through decades. And it should be noted that this wasn't a unintended consequence of legislative changes at this time, but rather was overt. Virginia State Senator Carter Glass of Lynchburg could not have been more explicit when he exclaimed, quote, "Discrimination. Why, that's exactly what we propose. That exactly is what the convention was elected for, to discriminate to the very extremity of permissible action under the limitations of the federal Constitution, with the view that the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of should be gotten rid of." And this movement of new state constitutions was not isolated to Virginia. The kind of New South parties of this time sought new constitutions that would disenfranchise African Americans in South Carolina in 1895, in Louisiana in 1898, North Carolina in 1900, and Alabama in 1901. Those all occurred before this 1902, and many would follow after. So to test the impact of these new voting laws, the League fielded their very first political candidate in 1903, just after these state changes. And they nominated Crandall Mackey for Commonwealth's attorney. Mackey faced stiff opposition from the incumbent, Richard Johnson of Johnson's Hill. The contest was a dead heat, and in the end, Mackey won by 2 votes. And according to the newspaper accounts, quote, "The reduction of the Negro vote under the new Virginia Constitution helped Mackey wonderfully," end quote. So despite charges of corruptions due to the extremely small margin of victory, Mackey and the League members used this election as a mandate. But these new voting laws were only one piece of the puzzle. In order to have more complete control of the county and its development, League members sought to remove African Americans and other allegedly less desirable elements from the land that they wanted for themselves. The links between race and League policies about development and reform can be seen in the League's dramatic and violent cleanup of Roslyn. Beginning in the 1870s, Roslyn's location immediately across the Aqueduct Bridge from Washington and about 1 mile from Fort Myer made it a hotspot for gambling and saloons. But Roslyn was also home to an African-American enclave, a small working class Black community. But rather than seeing a small working class Black community, which is how Roslyn's African-American residents would have seen themselves, League members characterized the enclave as, quote, a gathering of shacks that were inhabited by riffraff of the county, end quote. And while temperance and fears about political corruption around gambling were all kind of in the ether and were legitimate kind of social and political ideas of this time. I don't know if anyone else is watching Gilded Age, but like prohibition is big on that these last 2 weeks. So these are sort of in the air, but the League members really wanted to remove these saloons and places where you can gamble, specifically because these areas were not segregated spaces. Arlington's saloons were not segregated, they were interracial, and it was a place of fraternization and camaraderie across class and across race, and they saw that as a direct threat to the kind of society that they were hoping to build up. So on Sunday, May 30th, 1904, Mackey and members of the Good Citizen League, they armed themselves and they set out to clean up Roslyn once and for all. A posse of 6 embarked on the raid, Mackey, Lyon, and 4 other League members. And rather than using the county's sheriff or police force, which Mackey, as the Commonwealth's attorney for Arlington, would have every right to do, he instead decided to deputize these men and handed out several sacks full of weapons, including sledgehammers, axes, and a sawed-off shotgun. This group of vigilantes attacked 2 saloons in Roslyn, throwing people through closed windows and arresting patrons and employees, as well as destroying property, as these weapons were used to hack up bars, break slot machines, and destroy alcohol. The scene was chaotic and violent, but it thankfully only saw 1 shot fired when a League member fired his gun at the back of a fleeing African-American man who luckily was not struck. And with the reclamation of Roslyn, commercial and real estate development proceeded immediately, according to Ball. So I know that's sort of a cartoony looking picture of the raid, but it doesn't sound like a fun scene to have been a part of. With social, political, and literal capital behind them, Arlington's white boosters continued to grow. The physical growth of nearly 100 white communities in the first 3 decades of the 20th century meant that new neighborhoods encroached on those existing Black communities. That was the case in Queen City. Queen City was a small African-American working class neighborhood that developed just outside of the formerly closed Freedmen's Village. And it is about where the Pentagon is now. And developers realized pretty quickly just how fantastic the view, the location, the accessibility was from this area, and would encroach into the existing neighborhoods. Beyond this physical encroachment on lands previously designated as African-American spaces, the communities also established housing types that were distinct. So where the white developers would create kind of very like cookie cutter pre-established aesthetics, the conflicting kind of aesthetic visions between Black and white was just one other area of conflict and one other tool that could be used against these neighborhoods as claiming that they were somehow illegitimate. In what was becoming an increasingly standardized environment. This standardization would continue to go further. And that was in part because nearly all of Arlington's new communities contain restrictive covenants. So for those who may not be aware, a covenant is a legally enforceable contract imposed on the deed, imposed in a deed on the buyer of a property. And owners who violate the terms of the covenant risk forfeiting the property. Most covenants run with the land, which means that even if you were to tear down the house that's already on the property, you would still have to abide by those same covenants. Racially restrictive covenants refer to those contractual agreements that prohibit the purchase, lease, or occupation of a piece of property by a particular group of people, usually African Americans. Racially restrictive covenants were not only mutual agreements between property owners in a neighborhood not to sell to certain people, but they were agreements enforced with the cooperation of real estate boards, neighborhood associations, and racially restrictive covenants were common practice throughout the 1910s and would continue to expand at the exact same time that Arlington's growth is booming. Lions Park restrictive covenant stated that, quote, neither said property nor any part thereof, nor any interest therein, shall be sold or leased to anyone not of the Caucasian race, end quote. Alcova Heights covenants stated that, quote, no portion of said land shall be sold or leased to anyone of African descent. And in Barcroft, the school and civic leave were limited to residents, quote, who are members of the Caucasian race. This racial makeup was actually a selling point for Arlington's white neighborhoods. A Clarendon advertisement from 1915 highlighted not only the community's access to transportation, views, and beautiful suburban homes, but it also said that there was, quote, not a colored resident within the borders, end quote. And Lion Village advertisements ensured that potential buyers that their beautiful suburban community was, quote, destined to become a community of particular people, as it was reserved for the white race alone. So these aren't just contractual things that pop up in your home sale. They are indeed selling points. Now, these racially restrictive covenants, they joined other laws and regulations that were designed specifically to limit Black buyers and communities in Arlington. Some of our first suburban control ordinances started at this time with new county-wide planning laws. So all new neighborhoods had to be approved by the county engineer. And as a direct result of this law, Arlington was able to create racially segregated neighborhoods. And the law also legislated against older home styles and prevented individuals from doing their own construction, instead requiring use of professional contractors. So these provisions disproportionately affected Arlington's Black communities. Regulations which previously only applied to individual subdivisions were now used to regulate the county as a whole. So recall that Arlington's amenities that they worked so hard for throughout the first decade of the 1900s, those did not stretch into the Black communities. So these new county-wide standards threatened to condemn all existing Black neighborhoods who did not have access to the improvements that the county now demanded. This legislation was approved by the County Board of Supervisors with the influence of Crandall Mackey, who was a county politician. Mr. Ball was the treasurer of the Ball family. The clerk was George H. Rucker, who was a builder and a frequent contractor for Lions developments. So it's all kind of in the sauce. the housing choices for Arlington's African-American community were significantly limited by these laws. So where many new Black communities had been created throughout the end of the 19th century and the first few years of the 20th, now all of these new subdivisions, remember there's like 100 new subdivisions in the last 10 years, those are all racially restricted. They're not allowed to move there. So if these new neighborhoods are kind of creeping in, and there's the threat that the existing African-American neighborhoods are going to be condemned, there's nowhere to go. And from the 1910s onwards, these racialized restrictions and segregation laws established in Arlington meant that further expansion was not possible. So that meant you see a huge subdivision in those existing communities. So Johnson's Hill began in 1880 with just 4 plots, but by 1913, that same amount of land had 70 plots on it. Green Valley saw a huge surge in population and in subdivision. The neighborhood grew by 70 families during just the years of World War I. And residents who subdivided lots created multifamily housing and with duplexes, row houses, and apartments in Arlington's Black areas, including Green Valley and Roslyn. But this doesn't fit with the aesthetics that these county leaders and builders would like. So while the African-American community is creating homes to fill a need and creating homes in a different style to make way for a population that has nowhere else to go in the area, the legislation began to attack these styles of housing that were only seen within Black neighborhoods. All sections of Arlington County are threatened by row houses, warned one flyer generated by the Lion Park Civic Federation. The people of the Federation felt that row homes were threatening of the segregated suburban middle class ideal that they sought for themselves and their neighborhood. And without regard for whether or not Arlington's Black neighborhoods challenged or reinforced their own aesthetic visions, Arlington's white leaders steadily created zoning, planning, and covenant legislation in an attempt to push out the large and diverse communities that had been previously established throughout the county. And again, the resistance to these neighborhoods was kind of no matter what type of homes that were created. So the working class Queen City, as well as the middle class Butler homes, they were all threatened. I bring this up because the language of all of these zoning and planning laws, it's very dry and very, your fence shall be this many feet and that many height. But when in its application, it was extremely racialized and discriminatory, and also in its intent. It was those things as well. And again, Arlington's policies aren't happening in a vacuum. They're a part of state and national changes. Throughout the 30s and 40s and beyond, the Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual, for example, recommended the use of restrictive covenants as they were the only way to, quote, provide the surest protection against undesirable encroachment and inharmonious use. These policies became known as redlining because they showed African-American neighborhoods as red in the official loan maps. And it wasn't until 1968 that the inclusion of racially restrictive covenants in deeds became illegal. So I want to spend a moment talking about the 3 images on the screen now. So here we have a view of the library in the segregated Hoffman Boston High School. You have members of Arlington's African American Masonic Lodge. These are the images stacked on the left in my view. And then the member on the right is a KKK march through the Bon Air neighborhood. And I bring these up how racial separation can amount to both discriminatory segregation as well as providing space for Black communities to grow and for African American excellence. I think that those juxtapositions are an important one to think about, especially in works like mine, which are looking at the loss of all Black neighborhoods, which in some ways is also the end of residential segregation, which is a good thing, but something's lost and something's gained in these different aspects of what makes neighborhood, what makes community. So Arlington has an interesting path forward throughout the entirety of the 20th century, which is to say, kind of at every turn, the federal government continues to expand, and thus Arlington continues to boom and boom and boom. So, you see a huge expansion of federal positions, starting with the Civil War. That doesn't slow down. Continues in World War I, goes crazy in World War II, goes even more in the Cold War. It's just like up and up and up. So Arlington continues to see huge booms, particularly the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. So newly arrived federal workers from around the country choose to settle in Arlington in record numbers. Arlington had a population of 26,000 in 1300, 57,000 in 1940, 135,000 in 1950, and 162,000 by 1960. And suburban development throughout the county exploded in response to this rise in population and its corresponding demand. So these people and the environments that they created were in some ways a continuation of the suburban trajectory of Arlington's leaders from the previous decades. However, in significant ways, this boom was a departure of the visions of those developers, planners, and politicians like Mackey, Lyon, and the League. To accommodate such a huge influx of population, neighborhoods increasingly used higher density duplex, garden style apartment, and apartment developments, such as Fairlington, for example. And these building types joins Arlington's almost exclusively single family neighborhood. So now that zoning and planning legislation, which had previously been attacking, multiple style housing units, had previously been restricted to just being an attack on Black communities. Now those laws are chipped away at because there's a need for them elsewhere. The new arrival of war workers from around the country also led to a social shakeup in Arlington. Increasingly, new arrivals came from beyond the South. They created a new social and political climate in Arlington. Though far from perfect, the new arrivals ushered in an era of increased spending, school desegregation, and the preservation of Arlington's neighborhoods, both Black and white, through the Neighborhood Conservation Program, which allowed all neighborhoods that had survived to this point to continue to move forward. Now, also at this time, the federal government played a unique role in Arlington as both a nearby source of employment and as an authoritative power. So the government provided huge numbers of stable, well-paying blue and white-collar jobs for all Arlingtonians, including African Americans, decades before that would be the case throughout the South, indeed throughout the country. But at the same time, where federal employment attracted huge numbers of new residents to the area, that also threatened the existing Black communities. So large portions of Arlington would come to be physically occupied and controlled by the federal government. So you already had National Cemetery, but then beyond that, Fort Myer, the Navy Annex, the Pentagon, the National Airport, the Department of Agriculture's experimental farms would all come to consume Arlington. These pictures, the bottom image shows the neighborhood of East Arlington. You can see the Pentagon already constructed in the background. These residents were only given a few days notice before their land was taken through eminent domain, and they were relocated to trailer camps in the Green Valley neighborhood. The neighborhood was leveled, you can see that in the picture at the top, to make way for the Pentagon's parking lots. So the proximity to DC would have a major impact on Arlington in the physical occupation of the county, federal policies that impacted the area as well as the entire country, and also as an employment source. So it was always kind of this push-pull of the area. But significantly, the political and social dynamics of Arlington were drastically changed due to all of these new arrivals, which, as I mentioned, most of whom were raised beyond the South, most of whom were very well educated, and federal employees who didn't embrace the older political models that had been dominant in Virginia, which were based around racial authority, small government, and little spending. As a result, Arlington saw a huge expansion of municipal programs, including school and neighborhood improvements. And in this more moderate social and political climate, Arlington's already strong Black communities used their long tradition of community organization to push for more rights. So similarly, as you saw in Freedmen's Village, basically, if given the opportunity, because they already have these institutional developments, they're able to push it even further. So in this more moderate climate, Arlington's Black communities won court battles for school integration in 1959, making them the first in Virginia. By 1973, the three remaining African-American communities who had been able to resist that white encroachment, these are Knox Green Valley, Halls Hill, Highview Park, and Arlington View Johnson's Hill. Those three communities, because they survived until 1973, they are able to receive municipal improvement funds on the grounds of their historical significance under Arlington's Neighborhood Conservation Program. And this formal recognition given by the county would come to really help these areas for the next generation for preservation and create space for individuals to create communities for themselves. This wasn't without, ongoing threats around gentrification. With the end of former residential segregation in the 60s and 70s, which again, clearly a good thing, it also meant that for the first time, new generations of African Americans could look beyond these existing communities in choosing where they wanted to live. And thus some longstanding multi-generational neighborhoods and institutions began to shrink. Additionally, Arlington is no longer defined by Black and white alone, and instead the area is much more diverse with Asian and Latino residents, which are groups that did traditionally seek out Arlington's formerly exclusively Black communities. The county's built environment has also changed drastically. It's become a lot more urban, with businesses becoming decentralized and entering throughout the county, and the area shifted towards more apartments, especially with the expansion of the metro. Modern attempts to account for the discriminatory policies of the past, including the recent controversial Missing Middle initiative, have met with resistance from current residents who might not be familiar with how these policies and how these single-family homes came into practice and really were, from their onset, a political and social attempt at control. There are certainly areas for hope, though, as Arlington's Black communities continue to work to bring the area's new non-Black residents into community institutions. There's also an increased interest to recognize Arlington's African American community. Programs have been established to curb home prices and to keep generations of longtime Arlingtonian residents in the area and coming back. And with luck, a continued determination and continued evolution of community institutions, with hopefully the next generation of residents will be able to keep Halls Hill, Johnson's Hill, and Green Valley from losing their identities and continuing to be an important part of Arlington. So that's kind of where I will leave you. And I'm open now for questions.
That was terrific.
Oh, thanks.
Lindsey Bestebreurtje. If I recall, and Marty, who's running our Zoom, can correct me, I think we normally do a question from the audience, a question online, and the only reason I'm up here is I'm supposed to repeat the question so that you'll hear each other. So let's do the easy one. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes, sir.
Segregationist policies you found in Arlington symptomatic of those in Virginia and the South and different from those in Washington, D.C. and Maryland?
The question was, were the segregation policies found in Arlington systematic of Virginia and the South?
I think yes and no, which is, the historian's answer, I suppose. Because Arlington absolutely was a part of Virginia, was impacted by those broader trends. Washington, D.C. is very much a Southern city from its earliest foundings. But at the same time, DC isn't Richmond, Richmond isn't Alabama. So you see the different kind of like gradations and variations. I think that Arlington was very much impacted by the Southern outlook on its legislative policies. of the time.
And Marty, do we have any questions in the chat?
We do not.
Do we have another question from you answered everything, so
I'm just so thorough.
yes, in orange.
Yes, sir. Did historically from Freedmen's Village onward, did Black residents of Arlington have freehold title to their land? Were they leaseholders or were they just squatters?
The question was, did people in Freedman Village, Halls Hill, were they freehold owners? Did they have the property? Were they leaseholders?
Yes. So nobody was a squatter. I'll start there. I'm going to jump back to an image because this neighborhood that you can hopefully see, it's a little bit of a dark photo in the bottom of the screen, which is East Arlington, which was considered a working class community. You see some neat streets. You see cars parked in front of small houses. You see a church in the corner. That neighborhood was described as a gathering of shacks, which I think that sometimes when you hear in the historical record something like that, you think, oh, it was just nothing, maybe an outhouse. I don't know. But that to me is not a gathering of shacks. And I don't think the people who live there would have feel that way either. So that's just sometimes the language of the documents I would find does have those kinds of descriptors, squatters, shacks, things like that. But it very rarely reflected what was truly going on. Arlington's African-American population had a much higher rate of home ownership throughout the decades than other individuals throughout the country. And indeed, they had a higher rate of home ownership than Arlington's white residents for the first few decades of the 20th century. I have those statistics somewhere in my book, but I don't know them. But it was very much a home ownership. And I think that in a lot of ways, the lesson of Freedmen's Village was very clearly felt through that home ownership because residents there did not have formal deeds to their land, but had numerous, agreements and, gentlemen's agreements about this is your home and you're planting crops and you're doing this and you're expanding. So I think that experience probably colored.
Any questions in the chat now, Marty?
No, I put out a request, but I don't have any response.
All right. Well, do we have another question? Okay. Red shirt.
Thank you. So, I'm curious if you interviewed any of the current or former residents of Halls Hill and Green Valley, and if they think about the kind of opposing ideas of, yes, segregation, legal segregation is over, and maybe also lament the kind of disappearing of these formerly close-knit communities. Like, again, the tension.
The question was if the author interviewed any of the current residents of Halls Hill, and if there was sort of the balance of the nexus, sorry for putting words in your mouth, but between sort of the end of segregation and maybe the loss or impact on community.
So Arlington, I felt very lucky, has done a series of oral history interviews, particularly with the African-American community over the decades. There was one in the 90s, there was one in the 70s, there was one in the 50s, and all of those transcripts are in at the Virginia History Center at Central Library. So I definitely use those as a huge resource, but I have not done oral histories myself, which is something that I would love to be able to do. If anybody has a grant they want to give me,
Well,
I'm tech avail.
we can offer you a grant, and it's a good chance to make a plug that I'm very pleased that the Arlington Historical Society is undertaking oral history training for some of our volunteers. And obviously, as we get our bearings, we'll be happy to add more to the training. And we're really interested in talking about the Crystal City Underground, some of the things in Shirlington, and the Alexandria Aqueduct, and I'm sure there'll be other things. So you maybe can join us for a training.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Sean,
Yeah.
I have a couple good questions.
All right. You want to read them, Marty?
We'll start with one and then go from there. How did you become interested in conducting research on this topic or this subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I am a native of Virginia. I did K through PhD in Virginia public schools. But when I entered my doctoral program, I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to study, and was very interested in architectural history and the built environment, was very interested in the processes of segregation. And I came to Arlington as a topic, actually, when I was out walking my dog in the Shirlington area and saw a sign that talked about the founding of Green Valley in 1844 with Sarah and Levi Jones. And I was like, what? Like, I didn't know there would have been a free Black population here. I didn't know that they would have been allowed to buy land. Like, how did this become a community? And that was kind of the jumping off point for this particular topic.
Let's take the other question in the chat, and then we had a question in the audience.
Okay.
What was the?
All right. The other one, this may be a longer answer too, but where did you find the best sources for your materials in your book?
Yeah, so I used a lot of different sources, but I think the vast majority of my research came from the Virginia room at the Arlington Central Library. There were other resources in Richmond, lots of resources at the Library of Congress and at the National Archives, particularly as it related to the Freedmen's Village with the Freedmen's Bureau. And yeah, but mostly local history, local jokes get local work.
Yes, sir.
So I know there were instances in the 20th century of eminent domain being used to destroy Black neighborhoods intentionally, like the interstates in Miami. They chose the location for that with that in mind. Do you think that influenced the location of any of the big federal projects, such as the Pentagon, the airport, or the expansion of the cemetery? Or is that more of a unlucky coincidence that ended up destroying Black neighborhoods?
The question, if I got it correctly, is that there were examples of eminent domain being used deliberately to destroy Black neighborhoods. May there have been sort of a similar, possibly a similar thought process in some of the federal developments around here?
Yes. You see a majority of those projects listed are in South Arlington, which continues to be and was was at the time, the predominantly Black area, the much more working class area, and still continues kind of with 50 as that unofficial dividing line between North Arlington and South Arlington, continues to see that those ramifications. I think an easy visual example would be the difference between 66 and 395. So those are both highways. My husband's from California. He would be mortified. Freeways within the county. They're both, large interstates, but 395 that goes through predominantly formerly African American areas like East Arlington, like Queen City, like Johnson's Hill, is 8 lanes without sound walls and with streetlights, and 66 stayed very much along the previous W and OD railway lines. It is 2 lanes. It has sound walls, and you have to use HOV to do it. So that's kind of an example. Both areas have highways. Both areas had eminent domain, which resulted in the loss of some housing, but 8 lanes and 2 lanes, like, you're going to get different results.
Maybe one more question, and then you'll be signing books.
Yes.
All right. Do we have any questions either in the chat or in the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I was curious, both consequential to the Freemans losing their community and then the loss of Queen City, the dispersion. I'm curious if you came across any information that Alexandria was more amicable for African Americans to resettle when they lost their properties.
Okay. The question was in the loss of Halls Hill and Queen City, was our neighbor and rival. I'm sorry, I put that in. You did not. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Was Alexandria perhaps more amenable to the relocation of Blacks who needed to resettle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Alexandria did also have African American communities. You do see, so with the closure of Freedman's Village and some of those earlier losses of the enclaves throughout the 1900s, you mostly see people staying local, staying within the county. Alexandria is still local, but staying within the county. It's when you have the loss of the kind of mid 20th century and later 20th century neighborhoods that we're not quite sure where a lot of those folks went. The East Arlington and Queen City quite literally were just torn down like within a week. So some folks stayed local, but a lot of folks just kind of got lost. You weren't sure where your neighbors ended up, where folks ended up. So I'm sure that some folks did head to Alexandria, and I think that others just moved on.
Thank you. Yeah, I do know. I do think we had a presentation a number of years ago, maybe even by Jessica Kaplan, who's on our board, who's leading the memorializing the enslaved project, that there may have been sort of many diasporas from Queen City and environs into places like Fairfax. I think she did a presentation on that, and it might be somewhere in our new and revamped website, which everyone should check out. But if there are no more questions, I would say we end the session, and I think Lindsey will remain to answer books and can answer additional questions. So thank you again.